If you're studying A-level psychology, subscribe. I'm covering the essential topics across AQA, Edexcel, and OCR on this channel. Right now, as you watch this video, your brain is doing something extraordinary. It's taking in sound, vision, movement, and meaning simultaneously, filtering most of it out within milliseconds, holding a tiny fraction of it in a fragile temporary store, and deciding what, if anything, is worth keeping for the long term. You're doing this constantly, every second of every day, without any conscious effort whatsoever. But how does it actually work? Well, I'm picking up directly from video 1 on Milgram's obedience. And if you haven't watched the Milgram video yet, it's the first in the playlist and worth starting there. But if you're here for memory, you're in the right place. So in this video, we're covering the multi-store model of memory, one of the most important and most examined topics across AQA, OCR, and Edexcel. And by the end, you will know the 3 stores inside out, the key studies that support and challenge the model, and exactly how to use this in an exam answer. So let's get into it. Before we look at the model itself, let's establish what we actually mean by memory, because the way psychologists define it is subtly but importantly different from how we use the word in everyday life. In psychology, memory is not a passive recording device. It's not like a camera or a hard drive of a computer that simply captures and stores information unchanged. Memory is an active cognitive process, meaning it involves mental work, interpretation, and reconstruction at every stage. And that process has 3 distinct components. It has encoding, which is the first stage, converting incoming information from the outside world into a format that your brain can actually store. Think of it like translating a document into a different language before filing it. Storage is the second stage, retaining that encoded information over time. But crucially, storage is not passive. How long information is stored and how reliably depends on factors like how it was encoded, how often it was retrieved, and where in the memory system it sits. Retrieval is the third stage, accessing stored information when you need it. And this is where memory most visibly fails us. You know the feeling of having something on the tip of your tongue. The information is stored, but retrieval has broken down. Now here's a tip that applies across all 3 exam boards. When you are asked to outline or describe memory in an exam, always use all 3 terms: encoding, storage, and retrieval. Many students write about memory without mentioning encoding at all, and examiners will notice this. Now, why does it matter? Why do psychologists study memory? Here we've got 3 powerful real-world answers. Eyewitness testimony. If memory is unreliable, and as we'll see in a later video on Loftus and Palmer, it absolutely can be, then people can be wrongly convicted based on honest but inaccurate recollections. Understanding memory is literally a matter of justice. Dementia research. Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia involve the progressive destruction of memory systems. Understanding how normal memory works is the foundation for understanding what goes wrong and how to treat it. And education. Every revision technique that you use, spaced repetition, flashcards, practice questions, they're grounded in what psychologists have discovered about how memory works. And this is the most immediately relevant application probably for you right now. Richard Atkinson and Richard Shiffrin were both working at Stanford University in California when they published their model in 1968. Atkinson was primarily a mathematical psychologist. He liked formal, structured models that could be expressed precisely. Shiffrin brought a strong interest in the mechanisms of human memory, and together they produced something that changed the field. And the key to understanding why their model was so revolutionary lies in the historical moment they were working in. In 1968, it was the height of the computing revolution. Computers were becoming increasingly powerful, and the language of information processing, input processing, storage, output, was everywhere. Atkinson and Shiffrin borrowed this language deliberately. They proposed that the human mind works like a computer. Information comes in, gets processed, gets stored, and can be retrieved later. This was the information processing approach to cognitive psychology. Why was this revolutionary? Because at the time, behaviorism still dominated psychology. Behaviorism, which we cover in depth in a later video, insisted that psychologists should only study observable behavior. What happened inside the mind was considered off-limits, unscientific, and impossible to measure. The computer analogy changed all of that. Suddenly, internal mental processes could be modelled, predicted, and tested. If the mind is like a computer, you can study it the same way you study a computer, by observing inputs and outputs and inferring what must be happening in between. And here's something worth mentioning. In an extended answer, in order for you to show wider reading, Atkinson went on to become the president of the University of California system, one of the largest university systems in the world. Shiffrin is still active in research today, well into his 80s, continuing to publish on memory and attention. Their 1968 paper remains one of the most cited in the entire history of psychology. We have a key term also here to remember: information processing approach, a way of understanding cognition by comparing the human mind to a computer, focusing on how information is encoded, stored, and retrieved. And this is the theoretical framework underpinning the multi-store model. Now, this slide contains the single most important diagram in A-level memory. And I want you to pause here, look at it carefully, and make sure you can reproduce it from memory, because you may well be asked to draw or describe it in your exam. The model proposes that memory is not one single system, but a sequence of 3 distinct stores. Information flows through them in a linear, one-directional path. It starts with a stimulus from the environment, something you see, hear, smell, taste, or touch. That stimulus enters the sensory register. That's the first store. From the sensory register, if you pay attention to it, the information transfers into your short-term memory, and this is the second store. From short-term memory, if you use maintenance rehearsal, repeating it over and over and over, the information transfers into your long-term memory, and this is the third store. And here's the critical additional point that we can see here: forgetting. It happens at every transition. Information that is not attended to is lost from the sensory register within milliseconds. Information that is not rehearsed is lost from your short-term memory within about 30 seconds. And the model explains forgetting as a failure of transfer between the stores. When you're drawing this diagram in an exam, always include the arrows showing direction of transfer and label what causes each transfer. Attention between the SR and the STM, the sensory register and the short-term memory, rehearsal, between the short-term memory and the long-term memory. If you draw the boxes but leave out the transfer mechanisms, you will be losing easy marks. The key terms that you need to remember from this slide: the sensory register, the first store receiving all sensory input briefly; the short-term memory, STM, the second store, limited in capacity and duration; long-term memory, LTM, the third store, potentially unlimited in both; maintenance rehearsal, the deliberate repetition to keep information active in your short-term memory and facilitate transfer to your longer-term memory. The sensory register is the entry point of the entire memory system, and it's both enormous and extraordinarily brief. In terms of capacity, it's very large. Every piece of sensory information hitting your eyes, your ears, your skin, your nose, your tongue right now is being registered simultaneously. Your sensory register is processing an enormous amount of data every single second. But in terms of duration, it's extremely brief. And we're talking milliseconds to approximately 2 seconds. This information does not hang around. If you don't pay attention to it, it's gone almost instantly. The sensory register uses modality-specific coding, and that means information is stored in the same format it arrived in. Visual information is stored visually. This is called iconic memory. Auditory information is stored as sound. This is called echoic memory. The sensory register does not yet interpret or transform the information. It just holds the raw sensory impression momentarily. And this is where attention becomes crucial. Attention acts as a filter between the sensory register and the short-term memory. Of the enormous flood of sensory information entering the register every second, only what you consciously attend to passes through to the short-term memory. Everything else gets discarded. Think about what you can notice right now if you consciously attend to it. Sounds in your room, the feeling of your chair, the temperature of the air. All of that was in your sensory register a moment ago. You just weren't attending to it. George Sperling's 1960 experiment is the key supporting study for the sensory register. He showed participants a grid of 12 letters, 3 rows of 4, for just 50 milliseconds. That is 1/20th of a second. When asked to recall the entire grid immediately, participants could only recall about 4 or 5 letters. But, and this is the clever part, when Sperling cued participants with a tone immediately after the display indicating which row to recall, they could recall almost all the letters from that specific row. And this tells us that all the information was briefly available in the sensory register. Participants had registered all 12 letters, but it decayed so rapidly that by the time they had recalled the first few, the rest had gone. The partial report technique revealed that the whole report technique had hidden. Now, the phenomenon of iconic memory, the brief visual impression that lingers after you look at something, is why you can wave a lit sparkler in the dark and see a trail of light. Your sensory register is holding the visual impression of where the sparkler just was, even though it's already moved. Short-term memory is the store you are most aware of in everyday life. It's your conscious, working awareness of the present moment, and it has two defining characteristics that make it fundamentally different from your long-term memory. The first I'm going to look at is capacity, 7 plus or minus 2. George Miller published a landmark paper in 1956 titled The Magical Number 7 plus or minus 2. Through a series of experiments, he demonstrated that short-term memory can hold between 5 and 9 discrete items at any one time, with 7 being the average. This is why phone numbers were traditionally 7 digits long. It's why postal codes, pins, and short codes tend to cluster around that range. Miller also introduced the concept of chunking, organizing individual items into meaningful units to effectively increase the amount of information short-term memory can hold. The letters BBC are 3 separate items, but BBC as a chunk is 1 item, freeing up 2 slots in your short-term memory. Skilled readers, musicians, and chess players all demonstrate expert chunking in their domains. The duration, approximately 15 to 30 seconds without rehearsal. And this was demonstrated beautifully by Peterson and Peterson in 1959. They gave participants trigrams, 3-letter nonsense syllables like XQJ or BRT, and immediately asked them to count backwards in 3s from a random number. This counting task prevented their rehearsal. After just 18 seconds, recall had dropped to about 10%. After 30 seconds, it was essentially 0. This is direct evidence that without rehearsal, short-term memory decays extremely rapidly. Short-term memory encodes information primarily in an acoustic format, by sound. Even when information arrives visually, written words on a page for example, we tend to convert it into a sound-based code in our short-term memory. This is why you sub-vocalize when you're trying to remember a phone number. You repeat it to yourself as a sound. Evidence of acoustic coding in short-term memory comes from research showing that people make more errors when trying to remember acoustically similar items, words that sound alike, than visually similar ones. If short-term memory were visual, the reverse would be true. Maintenance rehearsal is the process of repeating information in a loop within short-term memory to keep it active and prevent decay. Think of it as a holding pattern. The information circles around until either it transfers into long-term memory through enough repetition, or rehearsal stops and it fades away. Peter and Peterson 1959 demonstrated rapid forgetting without rehearsal using the trigram technique, confirming short-term memory's limited duration. So your key terms here are capacity, duration, coding, chunking, maintenance, rehearsal, acoustic, encoding. Make sure you can define each one precisely. Long-term memory is the vast, permanent archive of everything you know, remember, and can do. And compared to short-term memory, its properties are almost incomprehensibly different. Capacity, potentially unlimited. There is no known upper limit to how much information your long-term memory can hold. The human brain contains approximately 86 billion neurons, each capable of forming thousands of connections. The storage capacity this creates is effectively limitless. The duration is potentially a lifetime. Memories encoded into the long-term memory can last decades, sometimes an entire lifetime. You can still remember your first day at school. You can still recall the words of songs you learned as a child. Long-term memory duration is extraordinary compared to short-term memory's 30 seconds. Encoding primarily semantic. Long-term memory encodes information by meaning, connecting new information to existing knowledge and understanding. And this is why elaborative rehearsal, thinking deeply about what something means and how it connects to what you already know, is far more effective for long-term memory than simply repeating something mechanically. And here on the slide, you've got Tulving's 3 types of long-term memory. Let me talk you through each one because the distinction will come up in an evaluation. Episodic memory. These are your personal autobiographical memories, where you were, what you did, who you were with. These are time-stamped personal events. Your memory of last Christmas, your memory of your first day at the school. These are episodic. Semantic memory are your general knowledge about the world, facts, concepts, language, meaning, the capital of France, what a verb is, who Milgram was. These are not attached to a specific personal memory. You know them without necessarily remembering when or how you learnt them. These are semantic. And procedural memory, your memory for skills and actions, how to ride a bike, how to type, how to drive a car. These are encoded differently for episodic and semantic memories. They're often automatic and very difficult to consciously articulate. And Tulving's distinction is crucial for evaluating the multi-store model. And the weaknesses makes this point clearly when we look at them. The multi-store model treats long-term memory as one single unitary store. But Tulving's work, and especially the case of HM, who we will be looking at next, shows that long-term memory is not one thing. It's at least 3 distinct things, and this is one of the most powerful criticisms of the model. So let's evaluate the model positively first, and remember, good evaluation always uses named evidence. Do not just say there is research support, name the study and explain what it shows. Peterson and Peterson, 1959. As we covered on a previous slide, their trigram experiment directly confirmed short-term memory's limited duration of around 18 to 30 seconds. This is exactly what the model predicts. This supports the model. Sperling in 1960. His partial report technique confirmed the existence of a large capacity but extremely brief sensory register, again, exactly as the model predicts. And then we have who I mentioned a minute ago, the case of HM. Henry Molaison is the most important single case study in the history of memory research. In 1953, when he was 27 years old, Henry Molaison, we call him HM, underwent brain surgery to treat severe epilepsy. The surgeon removed large portions of his hippocampus, a brain structure we now know is critical for memory consolidation. The result was devastating and scientifically extraordinary. HM could no longer form new long-term memories. He could hold a conversation normally. Short-term memory was intact. He could remember his life before the surgery. Existing long-term memories were intact. But anything that happened after the surgery simply would not transfer to long-term storage. Every time he met his doctors, it was as if he was meeting them for the first time. HM's case provides powerful evidence that short-term memory and long-term memory are anatomically and functionally separate stores, exactly as the multi-store model proposes. And this is one of the strongest pieces of supporting evidence for the model. And the big strength here as well is that the model is falsifiable. It makes specific testable predictions about capacity, duration, and coding that can be empirically investigated. And this is what good scientific theory looks like. The fact that so many researchers have been able to test it, support it, challenge it, and build on itself is evidence of its scientific value. Now the other side, and these criticisms are substantial. The first and most fundamental weakness is the oversimplification. The model treats both short-term memory and long-term memory as single unitary stores, as if each is one thing with one set of properties. And research has consistently shown this is not the case. Now, we used HM as a strength on the last slide, and here is a sophisticated evaluation point that will impress any examiner. HM is actually both a strength and a weakness for the model, depending on what aspect you focus on. As a strength, we said his case shows short-term memory and long-term memory are separate. Well, that's good. But as a weakness, his case shows long-term memory is not a single unitary store. Despite having no ability to form new episodic long-term memories, HM could still learn new procedural skills. He was taught to complete a mirror drawing task, tracing a star shape while only seeing his hand's reflection. And he improved at it over multiple sessions, even though every time he sat down to do it, he had no conscious memory of having done it before. His procedural memory was intact. His episodic memory was destroyed. This means long-term memory is not one store, it's multiple distinct systems. The multi-store model does not account for this. Tulving's types of long-term memory directly address this limitation. The model places enormous emphasis on rehearsal as the mechanism for long-term memory transfer, but we know from experience and research that rehearsal is not always necessary. There are flashbulb memories, which are the clearest example. These are vivid, detailed memories of the moment you hear about a personally significant or emotionally shocking event. Where you were when you heard about a major national event, the moment you received unexpected news. These moments are encoded with remarkable clarity and durability, not because you rehearse them, but because of their emotional significance. The model has no satisfactory explanation for why emotional arousal should affect long-term memory encoding. This suggests the transfer mechanism is more complex than simple rehearsal. And finally, the model implies a rigid one-way flow from SR to STM to LTM. But memory does not actually work this way. Long-term memory constantly influences how we process and encode new information. Your existing knowledge, expectations, and schemas shape what you attend to and how you interpret new experiences. The model presents memory as a passive conveyor belt, when in reality it's a dynamic, interactive system. The working memory model, which you'll see in the next video, addresses this by replacing the single STM store with a multi-component active working memory system. That is a direct response to the limitations that we've just discussed. So finally, we're going to nail the multi-store model in your exam and breaking it down into 4 steps: describe, apply evidence, evaluate, and conclude. And this is exactly the right structure for any extended response question on memory, regardless of your exam board. So let me walk you through each one with specific guidance for the topic. Describe. Outline the model's 3 stores with accurate, precise detail. For each store, you should give capacity, duration, and coding. Do not just name the stores. Examiners award marks for accurate detail. Sensory register, large capacity, milliseconds to 2 seconds, modality-specific coding. Short-term memory, 7 plus or minus 2 capacity, 15 to 30 seconds duration, acoustic coding. Long-term memory, potentially unlimited capacity, potentially lifetime duration, semantic coding. That is the core description. Number 2, apply evidence. Use named studies with findings. Peterson and Peterson for short-term memory duration. Sperling for the sensory register. HM for the separation of STM and LTM. Always explain what the study shows and why it supports or challenges the model. Do not just name drop the researchers. Number 3, evaluate. And this is where you introduce the working memory model as a counter-argument. A phrase like, however, Baddeley and Hitch proposed that STM is not a single store but a multi-component system immediately signals to the examiner that you understand the debate in the field. Use HM's procedural memory as evidence that LTM is not unitary. Use flashbulb memories to challenge the rehearsal mechanism. And number 4, finally, conclude. Always end with a judgment. Overall, the MSM remains a useful and influential starting point for understanding memory, but is considered an oversimplification of what are now known to be far more complex and differentiated systems. That sentence alone demonstrates the kind of evaluative thinking that examiners reward. 2 specific warnings worth flagging. First, terminology precision. Always call it the sensory register, not the sensory store or sensory memory. Always use STM and LTM in full or at least once. Put them in brackets and then you can use the abbreviations later. Never write short memory or long memory. Imprecise terminology signals to an examiner that you don't quite know the material. And 2, contextualize your case studies. If you mention HM, you must explain what his case demonstrates. HM is a case study that supports the MSM is worth almost nothing. HM's inability to transfer new information to LTM despite intact STM demonstrates that these are anatomically separate stores. Supporting the MSM's distinction between them is worth significant marks. And 3 mistakes students make constantly with this topic. 1 is confusing duration and capacity. Duration is how long information lasts. Capacity is how much can be held at once. They're different things. Know them separately for each store. The second mistake is failing to link rehearsal to LTM transfer. Do not just say information goes from STM to LTM. Say, through maintenance rehearsal, information is transferred from STM to LTM, where it can be stored potentially for a lifetime. And the third mistake is ignoring attention at the sensory register stage. Many students jump straight from stimulus to STM without ever mentioning that attention is what causes the transfer, and that omission costs marks. Well, that's the multi-store model of memory fully decoded. In the next video, we move directly onto the working memory model, Baddeley and Hitch's more detailed account of what is actually happening inside STM. If you want to understand why the MSM was superseded and how to use the WMM in evaluation, that's exactly where to look next. So subscribe so you don't miss it, and I'll see you there.